Anyway, it's now a real joy to be able to introduce the Reverend Dr. Sandra Millar, Head of Projects and Developments for the Archbishop's Council. This follows apparently a successful career in marketing with a number of organisations, including Boots and the Co-op. She was ordained in 2000 and subsequently served as curate in the St Albans Diocese, team vicar in the Oxford Diocese, so she knows from first-hand practical experience about taking funerals, and also Dawson advisor with children and young families in Gloucester. Her role as the head of projects and developments, she's heading up the work on funerals and baptisms, though obviously talking to us today about the research into funerals. And she's going to present, as Bishop Stephen said this morning, her initial research and their application to parish ministry. And this will, of course, continue to build on the very successful weddings project. So, Sandra, it's a delight to have you with us this afternoon. Thank you.
It's wonderful to be with you here in Sheffield. I have to say, I don't actually tweet very often, but this morning I was motivated to tweet by my experience of a Sheffield taxi driver. I got in the cab down at the wonderful Premier Inn, which hotel chain I spend a lot of time with, and I got in the taxi and he said, "Fine, yes, I'll take you there." He said, "Do you mind first if I just stop and go and get some potatoes for the missus?" I was like, this does not happen in London, I can assure you, but it was great. It was great to be here. So it's lovely to be here and able to talk with you. I'm going to, this talk that I'm going to give now is it's kind of quite tricky in a way, because it's drawn from some work that we now take a 24-hour residential to present to clergy who have been taking part in a pilot phase of the work we're doing. Sometimes I do it in a day, sometimes I do it in 2.5 hours. I've been known to get through the whole lot in 20 minutes. So we'll see how we get on together and share some of those things. A lot of what I'll say will reinforce what we heard this morning, and I'll try and move faster over some of those things so that we don't spend too much time looking at them again. I titled this talk, and I use this title quite from Taking Funerals Seriously. It's actually what we've called the national conference we're having in June around funeral ministry, Taking Funerals Seriously. And the phrase has come from my conversations with many people who are funeral directors and working in the funeral business. And the phrase is this: when they've met me and heard what we're doing nationally at the Church of England, they've so often just said, "Oh, I'm so glad to hear that the Church of England is taking funerals seriously again." And that's the phrase that has come from the trade, if you like, from the funeral directors. And I think we heard a bit of that sense this morning, that there's an eagerness to want us to do this well, from not just within the church, but from outside the church as well. Now, he said it would press and move forward, but nothing is happening. Oh, it has now. Okay, yeah. The Archbishop's Council projects. Originally, the idea was, after the success of the weddings work, that we would do a project that was called Ministry at the Time of Death. But one of the interesting questions that we realise is increasingly the church doesn't really do ministry at the time of death. Once upon a time we did, but many of us, it will be some considerable time, unless it's someone we're already journeying with on the way towards death. We very rarely now just get called out to be with someone at the point of death and time of dying. That is a whole issue that we've kind of shelved slightly at the moment, put on the back burner to come back to and revisit. And really what the work was about was funerals, and that's what we're talking about now. The overall aims of the projects is that they look at attracting people to choose the Church of England. Oh, it's moved on now. You've pressed it. It's gone. it's moving. Is that the general purposes of the work that I'm involved with, whether it's around weddings or baptisms or funerals, is that everything we do is about looking at how we can think about, as a church, attracting people to be involved with us at the point of transition in their lives, at the point of a major life event. It's also about building understanding, and that building understanding is two-way. We often think that our task is to build understanding with the public as to what it is that we're doing, so they understand what we believe and why we do it. But for me, this work is also about building understanding within the church as to what the public think and feel and need. I've discovered that we're really very good as the church at knowing what people want without ever asking them. And a lot of this work is about asking people what's really going on for them. And the care is about doing what we do in such a way that it really engages people into moving on further in their lifelong journey of faith, and in particular engaging in a way that means they discover that they are loved by God and have a place with God's people. So we've heard a bit this morning about the current picture of funerals. I really don't point this in the right place. And we've heard this as well, the figures, 2013, 160,000 funerals. These are from the statistics, the parish returns that you send in. So we suspect that, if anything, these are a slight understatement overall. Certainly from the work that we've done with funeral directors, they generally state it as a bit higher than this. But as we heard this morning, that's an awful lot of funerals, 3,300 funerals a week. One of the things I'll just say with that figure is to give you a scale of it, is this. Not long ago, I think it was last summer, I was speaking at the National Association of Cremation and Burials. You see, I have a very exciting life and I get to some very top events. I'm actually next week at the National Cremation Dinner. That's a worry, isn't it? That's a worry. It's a vegetarian menu. Anyway, I was sharing a platform with a person who does a similar job to me, but for the National Humanist Association, a woman who is one of the leading providers of training for civil celebrants, and me. And we'd all done our little spiel, and then someone said, questions. And a person asked the question, how many funerals do you all do? Well, the person from the civil celebrants training said, I don't know, but I know how many people we train. And we train about 150 people a year in her organisation to be celebrants. And then the person from the National Humanist Association said, well, we do know how many we do. Our official figures as humanists is that we do approximately 6,000 funerals a year. So I said, the Church of England still does 3,300 funerals a week, which is a completely different scale. And that's really important, because it means that whatever we say in terms of the research, it's such a big area that we're working. There's always going to be variance and difference at a local level. It also means that the potential for us of doing things well, and the impact it has, is great. And also the impact when things go wrong. So, for example, if you lose your luggage at the airport, do you know the actual percentage of luggage that gets lost at an airport is really minuscule? It's like 1.4% of suitcases get lost. But because the volume is so high, the impact in actual numbers is enormous. Now, let's say that there's 10% of funerals that are done not so well. If the humanists do 10% of funerals not very well, that's about 50 a month, 12 a week in the whole country. 12 funerals a week that might be done badly. Let's say we also do 10% of our funerals not too well. That's 330 funerals each week that we do not so well. And the impact is enormous on people. So the scale of what we do is huge. We've also heard about the 200,000 people a week who attend funerals. I still haven't worked out where I'm pointing this to. It's not working. Okay, thank you. 200,000 people, 200,000 journeys. One of the things that we talk about a lot with this is the people that come to funerals. When we add together all the people who attend to funerals, to weddings and to baptisms in the Church of England every week, we realise that we have approximately 500,000 people attending services at the Church of England every single week. 500,000 people. And that's without us doing anything. We haven't spent any money to do that. We haven't set up a new initiative or anything at all. We just have people who have contact with us through these occasional offices. But let's pause for a moment and think about who these people are when they come to funerals. The thing is, everybody who's present at a funeral is there because they themselves are on a particular journey and they're on a particular a story to tell. One of the interesting things about funerals is that everyone who's there brings with them the memory of their own life experience of loss and of death. Each person who sits there may be there with a different reason. So, for example, you can be there because you're supporting your best friend because her mum died. But as you sit there, what's in your mind is the memory of the difficult time when your granddad died, or the time you lost your baby, or last year when your own dad died. Whatever it might be, each person there will carry with them at that moment a memory, a story of their own faith and their own journey. And that's also a good time to mention to you something about the whole notion of who is a chief mourner at a funeral. We often think about chief mourners, and one of the things to say is the language of chief mourner, to some extent, is what I might call transactional language. It's language that comes from the funeral director, and it's often related and referring to those who have booked and paid for the funeral. But who might be the chief mourner from your point of view in the service? I'll give you an example. I too took a funeral last Monday of my aunt, and it was she was 84, but my family, my extended family, my mum was one of 12. And they're slowly disappearing. And as it happens, when Auntie Margaret died, it means that there's now only one sister left. And she happens to be the youngest of this family of 12. And do you know what? She was really, really distressed at that funeral. More distressed than my auntie's grown-up sons. And she said to me at least 3 times during the day at different points, I am now the only one left. And I realised that, in a way, she was the one for whom the grief was really hard and easily overlooked, because the chief mourner is considered to be someone different. Or the chief mourners might be the couple who've lived next door to the deceased for 50 years, and they're the ones that live in your parish, whereas the adult children might be going somewhere else. So thinking about the congregation has turned out to be a really important thing. We heard this morning about funerals. I think funerals are a growing market, and this is why I'll use some marketplace language. You see, funerals are the ultimate universal market, because the truth is everyone will die. Now, I have to say, once, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, before I did this job, I was in the queue in Sainsbury's in Gloucester, and it was one of those times where there was an epidemic, you know, and the newspaper headlines were full of things like everyone's going to die from, I don't know, pig flu or chicken flu or whatever it was, you know, one of those diseases. And the Daily Express, the Daily Mail, all over the place, we're all going to die. And all these ladies are in the queue, and they're all kind of twittering at each other going, oh, isn't it terrible, is it terrible, we're all going to die. I don't know why they always sound like they're in a Monty Python sketch at that point, but they always do. And they're all sort of going like this, and suddenly I looked round into the queue, and I wasn't wearing a dog collar actually, but I looked round into this queue and I said, I'll tell you what, ladies, the truth is we're all going to die. And a kind of stunned silence fell over the queue. And then one of them looked at me and went, wow, you're a right cheery one, aren't you? At which point I smiled and says, yes, well, I think you'll find my friends think I am actually a right cheery one. That's the truth. Everyone will die. This is the ultimate universal market. We used to think it was taxes until HSBC and Gary Barlow, but now we know different. The other thing is, there is an increase in the number of over 65s in our population. An apology to any of you here who are in this next age group. You will know about the baby boom generation, and you will know that at every life event they've hit, we've seen a big increase. So, for example, in the 70s, there was a big increase in the number of weddings. And now that generation is reaching the end of their lives. They are coming into the final phase. I'm sorry, folks. However, they are not going to, it's not going to reach a sort of sudden point where they all, you know, drop off, as it were. We're going to see a very slow, steady increase, because life expectancy is also increasing at the same time. But because that generation is reaching the end, there will be, in the next 10 to 20 years, an absolute increase in the number of people dying in our country, which means the number of funerals that are needed is also growing. The thing about this is this is the baby boom generation, and as someone put it to me, the generation who created Woodstock are not going to go gently into that good night. And this is unlike a lot of markets that we see around us. A lot of the sort of new things that come into a market are driven by young people. We see it as something that's change being initiated by a new generation. Actually, it's the over 65s who are influencing the changes that are happening in and around both death and about funerals. But as we heard this morning, within all of that change, at the moment, the Church of England is still the major provider of funeral ceremonies. But as we heard, in a growing market, competition increases. We've been doing some research. We heard a bit about the research we've done in Chester, and a lot of what we've done echoed the same things. The research that I've been involved with has been done with the clergy. We had focus groups with around 300 clergy and lay ministers. We've also had some major research with the public, asking them some quite in-depth questions about what they think about funerals and so on. We've talked to various people within the funeral industry. That sounds like a strange word, but as well as funeral directors, there's a whole lot of other people that work around funerals. All kinds of people, such as those working around the production of coffins, those working around flowers, those working around embalming, and so on. Lots of different people. So we've been talking to those as well. And we've talked also a lot with funeral directors. And all of that is what underpins what we're doing. And as we heard, without a doubt, there is a changing culture on funerals. One of the things is that in many ways, the biggest thing that's happening to us is that so far in our culture, death has been seen as the last taboo. Until that film came out last weekend, we might have thought there were other things that were taboo. But we've learned that they're not taboo. In fact, it is death that is the last taboo. People do not want to talk about death. We heard too this morning about the decline in the sense of people wanting to belong to something and they don't quite know who they do belong to. And we also heard this morning about the idea of the conversation between the spiritual and the religious, and also the fact that people do want to talk about what happens after death, but they talk about it as afterlife rather than talking about after death. So the culture is changing. What did we find when we talked to clergy? We found that clergy see funeral ministry as a privilege. Many of us know that it is. It gives us an insight into a family, into their fragile history, into their interests, their passions. They share that with us at a very vulnerable time. For many of us, funeral ministry is extremely worthwhile, and it's something we are proud of. It's one of the few areas of ministry we often get instant feedback. You know, I don't know about you, but I've noticed this, that sometimes, you know, the day you leave your parish is when someone comes up to you and says, "Oh, I will miss your preaching." I'm like, well, perhaps if you told me that in the previous 5 years, I might not be leaving right now, because no one has ever said a word. But when you do a funeral, we very often get an immediate sense of a job well done. We get someone saying, "Thank you so much, and thank you for helping us." So there's a sense of pride in it. The challenges, of which there were many, and really in a way the phrase there sums it up, the two main challenges. One is a challenge about the sheer pressure of this ministry in terms of the volume and the demands of it, expressed in the line, "Following up is desirable, but not always easy." There's almost a reluctance. We have to be sure whether we want to engage with this ministry or not. And then, of course, the funeral director issue comes up. In this case, it says funeral directors have favourite clergy, but the list of comments about funeral directors would fill the entire presentation when we were talking to clergy. And this interesting statement when clergy were talking about what the future might look like. In the future, they can do it all without us. If we disappear, funerals will still happen and pastoral care will still be there. And that, again, was something we started to hear this morning. We are not the only people that are working in this area. So what are some of the main things that, in response to what we've heard, we discovered that we need to be doing as a church? One whole area is that we need to communicate more effectively with the public about what we do. We need to communicate actually before death happens. I'm going to say some more about that in a moment. And we also need to communicate more clearly about what we do with funerals, with the public and with funeral directors. So let's talk about before death and thinking about dying. I always put this quote in because it's to honour the people who shared with us their stories in the research that we did, and also to remind us of what matters to people when they start to think about death and dying. And we found that people are concerned with 4 particular things. Who do they belong to? What's their community? Who will they be with at the moment they die? How will it happen? And where will they be? And this is one of the women who was talking to us in our research, and she said this: after he retired, that's his work community, he took to going to the pub, that's his social community, for a pint in the evening. He came home, that's where he is, as usual. He sat in his chair, I was sitting where I normally sit. He's with his wife, doing some sewing, and that was it. He was gone. How? Sudden death. 1 in 4 deaths are sudden deaths. And the commonest place that people will die is actually a hospital or a residential care home. Hospices are wonderful and fantastic places and have done a really big thing in building their awareness in the public's mind, really, as being the place where dying can happen well. But only 5% of deaths actually happen in a hospice. You're most likely to die in the hospital or a care home or suddenly. So that's an interesting thing to think about. But we discovered that people do want to think about dying. And in our research, we discovered the idea, as we said, that death is the last taboo, but that there is a place to talk about it. Now, I was talking about baby boom generation and pushing at the boundaries here. And one of the things that's happened is, and you can pick this up in our culture, is that the generation that we're talking about is beginning to push that taboo about talking about death. And you will notice it in a number of ways. You'll notice it in the number of documentaries that appear on the television, like My Last Summer, watching people move towards death. You'll notice it in the number of articles that appear in newspapers talking about death and funerals. You'll notice it in the number of novels that are preoccupied with dying and with death as a theme. You'll even see it in films that suddenly appear that are very successful, like The Marigold Hotel, that are actually about aging, dying and death, because this generation are questioning and pushing the taboo. There are a couple of key movements as well to notice in that. One is the whole organisation called Dying Matters, or Dying, which every year does a week called Dying Awareness Week, where it tries to raise the profile of how we should as a culture be talking about death and dying. We also know from our research at a personal level that people find if family members know the preferences of the person who's dying, they can feel more at peace about putting the funeral together. And so you'll find a proliferation of websites called, like Final Fling, My Funeral Wishes. You will find funeral directors have forms available where people can make known what it is they want to do. And in fact, we're working on one at the moment that will be available on our website to allow people to record their wishes and start thinking ahead of what it is that they want, because it gives people peace in knowing those preferences. There's also been something very, very successful called Death Cafe. Has anyone come across Death Cafe? I wasn't expecting huge numbers here, but Death Cafe is a very fast-growing grassroots movement. And basically, Death Cafe is a cafe space where people gather to talk about death, dying and funerals. And when I discovered this, it's a great movement. It's set up by a lovely man, a lovely Buddhist man called John Underwood. And when I heard about it, I thought to myself, I know an organisation that has space. I know an organisation that's good at tea and cake. And I know an organisation that ought to be holding, in both sense of the word, the conversation about death, dying and funerals. And out of all of that, we developed something called Grave Talk. And we piloted Grave Talk in Lichfield Diocese and now in a further 150 parishes. And it's really, really been successful. And all it is, Grave Talk, is a set of conversation cards to start a conversation around death, dying and funerals in a cafe space. And it's being published by Church House Publishing in May this year. And we're launching it nationally then, because it really is working incredibly well to get people talking and thinking. And part of the reasons to do that is to reclaim some of the authority and experience we have as the Church of England to hold that public conversation. Because believe me, if we're not there having that conversation, other people will be very soon. Other people, there's a lot of energy from the secular movement to try and hold that public conversation. So Grave Talk is a tool that will allow us to do that. We also ask the public quite a lot about what they think a funeral means. What's it for? And the number one thing comes back to us is that people see the funeral as reflecting on life. Now that's life in two senses. They do see it primarily as a place to give thanksgiving for the person who has been deceased. The priority is that. And they also see it, though, as a moment when you do actually reflect on life. It's a pause in our daily routine when we do let, even for a moment, those bigger questions like what am I here for, what will happen to me at the end, come into view. I love that little quote at the end. All these quotes are from the research. The nearer you get to that age, the more you're likely to think, well, maybe there's somebody up there to help you on the way. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But you might as well give it a try. That's deep faith for you, isn't it, really? Can we just go back a moment and just jump there? People also see the funerals as very much a stage in which you let go of the person. It's a process that you go through in grieving. So it's a marker, a transition from one thing to another. It's also in many ways, although people don't articulate this fully, but underneath is this real sense that this is actually the last thing you will do for someone. That's what people will often say. It's the last thing I can do for him, the last thing I will do for her. And what that's about is a sense of always it being the last social engagement that we have as a person is there in a funeral where all our friends and family are together. And also people have very hesitant and tentative thoughts about life after death, which is important and something we'll come back to when we think about the service. When we ask people what about a funeral, what do they think it is? As far as what we do, there's a huge amount of confusion. People don't really understand what a Church of England funeral is. They don't know where it can happen. If we talk about a church funeral, well then it's a church funeral in the church. But then what are all those funerals that we do at the Crem? Can I have a funeral even if I've never been to church? Can a minister come to me? And we discovered that people really don't understand. For example, when it comes to green and woodland burials, people think the church often assume that the church cannot conduct such a funeral, but we can be there at a graveside in a woodland site. So one of the things we've done, and you'll be able to pick up a sample of this at the end, we've been working on this research to create some new resources which are currently on trial. You can't buy them yet, you won't be able to get hold of them until the middle of this year, but I'm going to leave samples of them all at the back. And this is a leaflet that we've produced called We're With You Every Step of the Way, and inside it just lays out very simply what a Church of England funeral is, what you can expect, and how to get in touch with someone. We also have a new website. This is not, you can look at it and you can tell people about it, although we haven't yet been promoting it nationally because it's been in research. But it's called, and you'll need to put in this whole name, churchofenglandfunerals.org. So that's got a lot of information on it. The funeral director, they do come up a lot, don't they? One of the things we found in our research was that to the public, the funeral director is a hero in the organisation of a funeral. Of course there are some experiences that are bad, but primarily they're seen as really positive. They take responsibility off you. They go through everything that needs doing. And I couldn't echo more strongly what Robert said this morning, that actually we have to respect what funeral directors do. We as clergy do not do funerals. We take the public, visible tip of an iceberg. Funeral directors have a huge amount of things to do as well. They transport bodies, they care for those bodies, they make sure they're looked after, they do the paperwork, they bring bodies back from overseas, they connect families, they negotiate sometimes with families, they work out the admin, they look after so many different aspects of it as well. And they know what has to be done. They sort out everything. And the advice they give, and this is really important to us, is trusted and followed. Whatever the funeral director says is considered to be something valid. So if they say, the Church of England minister locally does a good job, they will believe them. That's why this relationship is so important. If we move on, we'll hear that we ask funeral directors what they want from us. Funeral directors want a celebrant who meets the needs of the family. And again, we heard that this morning. They want a celebrant who's easy to work with, which means available and customer focused. And often as clergy, we talk about them, and in our research with clergy, we pick this up too. We almost end up talking about funeral directors as if we're in opposition to each other. And in fact, we're working towards the same goal. And the funeral director is often trying to juggle a lot of things into place. One of the things that most annoys funeral directors is that clergy have Friday as their day off. And we know from other research that 42% of clergy have their day off. Why that annoys them is because increasingly with diverse families, Friday is the day that people will come, because they come together for the weekend. They want to get everything sorted so they can tell people what's going to happen as they go into the weekend. If they can't get hold of clergy, they get really irritated. That gives us that reputation for being disorganised. When we don't get back to them, they just think we're chaotic. We may be chaotic, but we don't necessarily need to give that impression. The rigid rules hurting families we heard about this morning as well. I would also add something else here just to say this. This is really important generally for when we're talking to people outside the church, which includes funeral directors. People don't always find it very easy to distinguish between different denominations and their practices. And people pick up a lot of general ideas about what the church does. And they're informed by all kinds of things on public television, comedy programmes, all kinds of things. They may or may not be representing the Church of England. They may be representing another faith tradition altogether. They might be representing Roman Catholics. They might be representing a free Pentecostal church. All kinds of different things. But people won't distinguish that, and they'll lump it all together. And funeral directors also do that. And some of the things about rigid rules aren't always about the Church of England when we dig a bit deeper. But it does sometimes take a bit of digging. And the good news for us is this, and it's a simple thing, but it also makes it very difficult as well, that relationship is what will make the difference. And I will say this, any system you create in your deanery, in your team ministry or whatever, for phone answering or whatever, will only be as good as the quality of the relationships you've already made. Think of it like this, if you had a business and you had a public-facing part of that business, and that business was your livelihood, you're actually going to trust the public-facing part of that business to a stranger who you've never met, the bit on which you'll be evaluated and judged. Because the point is, the family aren't going to come into the funeral director and say, you didn't care for that body properly, I didn't like the way you put it in the hearse, because they're not there at that point. What they are going to come in and say is that service was terrible. But the funeral director has given that part of his business or her business to someone else. The more they know you, the more they trust you, the better it is. And then you can operate your phoning system. So the phone system doesn't replace the investment in relationship. I'm going to skip that slide because we're short of time. One of the messages we're trying to get over through the work that we're doing is the whole message to funeral directors is that we want to work with them. We want to be in partnership. Now, in our pilot parishes, we've got 150 parishes working differently at the moment. We've got some amazing stories emerging very quickly of how investing in the relationship with the funeral director changes things. So somebody went along to their funeral director and just went to them and said, do you know, I've realised I'd like to tell you that I really like taking funerals, and I'd really like to take more of them. As blunt as that. And the funeral director said, okay then. I mean, they had a few more conversations. In the first 6 months of last year, this person had done 3 funerals. After that conversation, in the next 3 months, they did 10. That was the difference about having a conversation with the funeral director. We've got several other stories emerging from parishes who've made a decision to go and invest in the relationship with the funeral director, making a real difference. Part of that investment is in helping funeral directors understand the pressures that we're under. You know, the kind of breadth of work that we do, as well as understanding more of what they do. We heard a bit about that as well, about really offering pastoral concern for funeral directors who often carry quite a lot of strain. You know, when it's a difficult funeral, they're under as much stress and strain as we are. We've been looking at ways, you said, of investing in that partnership and honouring that partnership. So it's actually saying to the funeral directors, we respect you and we value the work we do together. At a very local level, it can be as simple as this. The next time you have a new incumbent licensed in your parish, think carefully about who are the people you're inviting to that. Do you actually invite the local funeral directors? We often invite the school governor, the head of the school, we often invite the mayor or the chair of the parish council, but the person that the new clergy person is often going to work with the most, after perhaps a school, is a funeral director. And inviting them in early on is part of honouring their work and saying we're in partnership. In our pilot diocese, we've also had bishops' breakfasts for funeral directors, where we've simply invited local funeral directors along to meet with the bishop, not to tell them what they do wrong, not even to let them, just to honour them, to feed them well, and to talk to them, and to say thank you for the work that you do. We're glad we're in partnership together in this diocese. So that relationship is really important. The hard bit with that, in a way, is to say it's quite a difficult thing. I think sometimes nationally we feel that people would like us to come up with a really simple, one-stop tool that we could give you and say this will solve all your problems. But it isn't going to be like that. What we've discovered, it is simple. It's about investing in relationship, and how you do that will be up to you. But we're trying to provide some of the ways of making that possible. We also think, as we heard this morning, that we can recognise the strengths that we already have. We can hold celebration and loss together. We do have experience and authority. We do offer hope and comfort, and we are a national church, which means we're wherever and whenever people need us. Let's move forward on that. We've heard about this morning, the importance of telling their story and celebrating a life. So we'll shift on a little moment, because we talk about telling God's story. In our information leaflets, we talk to people about the two things that will happen in a funeral service. Is yes, we will tell the story of the person who's died, but we'll also tell the story of God's love. We'll talk about the reality of loss. We'll talk about the need for hope. And we'll make sure it's relevant to the story of the life of the person that's lived. That's what makes it human and warm. I went and heard a talk. I think this time I was at the Ideal Death Show, but I went to a talk about public speaking, and the person who was speaking, rather interestingly, didn't know that there was a clergy person present, which is interesting what happened. And I'm very often the only clergy person at all these events, by the way. They were talking about public speaking. They talked about the times when we're in cat mode and the times we're in dog mode. When we're in dog mode, in fact there's an advert on the telly at the moment that talks about this, when we're in dog mode, it means we're on the front foot. We're like Labrador puppies. We're reaching out and saying, be friends with me, I'm with you, engage with me. When we go into cat mode, we go into that sort of more distant, formal mode, where we're saying, when I'm ready, come and join me, yeah? Now, neither is right or wrong. Both are valid in terms of public speaking. The interesting thing to me was, when she talked about cat mode, what she said was, if you want to imagine and think about people in cat mode, imagine a vicar taking a funeral. Yeah, that was the impression that she'd got. Now, I think that balancing the reality of loss, the need for hope, and so on, is actually where we get the balance right between when we're in dog mode and when we're in cat mode, taking the service. When we're in dog mode, we're reaching towards people, being warm and friendly and human. We need sometimes to go into cat mode in order to do the things that carry the weight of emotion and the reality of loss, when we're commending a person into God's care and committing them to be buried. Those are the things we need to do formally, and there's no doubt that people value that as well. We have experience and authority. We're good at holding grief. We're good at being personal. And one of the things we also found in the research is that there's a little opportunity that we've been missing, and sometimes funeral directors catch this moment, The gap between when we've made the arrangements for the funeral and when it happens is really important. And we're producing a special card actually to leave with families with a prayer in, saying, we don't wait until the day of the funeral to pray for you. We're always praying for you, you know? Just reminding people that we're there all the time. Good funeral directors will often ring up on the night before or the morning of a funeral to check that the family's okay. And having contact in that gap time can be really, really important to people. One of the pressures with funerals is that the goal, if you like, is the standard is really high. Expectations are high. We need to do it well, and we need to be consistent in doing it well. The good news, as we heard earlier, is that often we do it well. We are good. But when we do it badly, the impact will be enormous. And there's this whole sense of when we do it well, we put across to people that we really know the person who's died, even if we've never met them. And that's really good. We heard also about aftercare. Aftercare is enormously important. It is the one thing that we do that at the moment, it is important to say at the moment, others don't do. And there are different aspects to that aftercare. There's the whole sense of who we do it with, how it happens immediately at the funeral, what we offer in terms of being wherever people need us to be, through prayer and through having churches that are open. I was saying at lunchtime, I think yet another reason why our cathedrals see so many people in them is that they provide a space in which people can come and simply sit with their feelings, light a candle and remember their loved ones. And in our research we picked up again, people do feel very positive about the church, and the fact that we're there is a welcome reassurance to them. So that aftercare is a very important part of everything that we offer. We need to be the ones that keep contact. This has come through, this is one of the most important things, because this has come through in every piece of research we've done. Research around weddings, research around baptism, research around funerals, and it's this. People want the church to be in touch with them after an event, but they have a really low expectation and experience that we will keep in touch with them. If we were working in a large retail chain like I've done in the past and we'd found a piece of research that showed that, let me tell you, heads would roll, people would be in trouble, big questions would be asked. Because what it's saying is our customers, our people who we have contact with, all these people who meet us every week are actually saying, we like your organisation, we would like to hear from you again. But we're not sure that we're important enough to you for you to bother. We don't really think you'll deliver on that. Now, I don't know about you, I probably reveal my shopping habits at this point, but you know, let's say, for example, one might have a thing about stationery and have shopped in Paper Chase or something, or you know, like pretty floral things and have gone to Kidston or somewhere. Once you've been to one of those places and you fill in a little thing at the till, they will send you an email every month until you stop and say, I don't want it. And that email will tell you new and interesting things that happen. And of course it will be sometimes about the products that are coming up, but sometimes it will just be general information that's useful and helpful, because they know that they have to keep in touch with the people that have made contact with them. And they keep in touch with me whether or not I go back in their shop, because they also know something else, that getting in touch with people once is not enough. Getting in touch with people twice is not enough. You have to keep on being in touch with people. And I think one of our simplest problems is we give up too soon. We expect people to be back to us really quickly. We think that if we've done a funeral last month, if they're not visiting us by Easter, maybe they won't turn up again. Actually, it might be 2 years before they make it, but we need to keep in touch with people. And just by being in touch makes them feel connected and part of what we're doing. It makes us feel like they've been invited and that we are friendly. So that's a really huge, important thing to be thinking about. Another thing that's massively important is the journey to remembering. One of our fastest growing services, possibly the fastest growing services in our churches over the last few years, has been almost any occasion that's to do with remembering, to do with loss and grief. I don't really remember Sunday itself. I mean, we may traditionally call it All Souls. I don't know about you, but our All Souls service in our parish, when we have a regular Sunday attendance of just around 30, our All Souls service this year had 92 people in it. Came along and lit a candle to remember someone. And one of the things we've been trying out in the pilot is encouraging parishes to look at different opportunities for remembering, not just All Souls. Because to be truthful, although it's grown in importance, for most of the public it means absolutely nothing. The biggest occasions in the year when people feel aware of their loss and bereavement are quite easy for us to identify. We've just had one this weekend, actually. And some of our pilot parishes were holding remembering events on this weekend. Because you know what? If you've lived your life in partnership with someone who's no longer with you, Valentine's Day is pretty crummy as you walk out on the high street and every single shop, every single restaurant tells you you should be there with another person. So putting on a remembering event at Valentine's Day can be significant. Christmas, enormous for people. The first or the 10th Christmas without someone you love remains a time when it's hard. Mothering Sunday, Father's Day, all these public events when family and relationship is celebrated is a time when loss is in sharp focus. So we're encouraging people to look at that, not just look at our calendar, but think about the public calendar. And increasingly, if we don't do this, funeral directors will do it. Civil celebrants will join with funeral directors to offer this. We can boldly say at the moment that the work of the civil celebrant is over at the point when they've done the service. But I'm not sure for how long we'll be able to say that, because increasingly they're working in partnership with the funeral directors. Good civil celebrants that I've met, and there are many, really take their work seriously. They're very compassionate people, and they would like to do more. They will go on bereavement training. They will think about contacting people to invite them to times of remembering. So the journey to remembering is enormously important. So the key messages that have come out of the research is we need to remind the public and help them to understand that we're there all the time, that we do things wherever they need us to be, that we have some strengths to offer and communicate. And the small changes we can make in our practice will make a big difference. And those changes are simple, really. It's about being more confident in who we are and that we have a message to offer. It's about being professional in the way we work with fellow professionals, particularly the funeral director. And it's about saying to families, let me see if we can make that happen, rather than no. If we say no outright to people, we close down things, and it's really hard to pull back from that. If we say, well, I'm not sure about that, but let me have a think and see if we can make something work for you, it builds a relationship and makes connection. So all those things are the things we're working on at the moment. You can get a lot more information. I mentioned the funeral conference, but there's only 3 places left on it now, so I won't tell you about that. So the thing I was going to tell you about, which I've missed, was something called, this is really important, the Church Support Hub. You can go on this right now. It's been in pilot trial, but you can have a look at it. It's the website that's for the church, and on it has all the information about weddings, baptisms and funerals, lots of downloads, lots of information. It has the highlights from the research that we've been doing, and come July it's where you'll be able to go to buy notice that word, to buy the resources that we've been making available nationally. I'm sorry I had to whiz through that. It's 24 hours into sort of 45 minutes, so but thank you for listening. Thank you.